know about the Spartacus uprising, the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal destroyed 2 Roman armies, and the tragedy in the Teutoburg forest. But what if I told you that these battles are just the tip of the iceberg? What if there were battles that were far more terrible and their outcome changed the course of history forever, even though almost no one has heard of them? Today we will talk about the deadly battles of Rome that are not included in school textbooks, but in which tens of thousands of soldiers died. Battles in which armies disappeared and great commanders suffered humiliating defeats. This is the story of how the Roman Empire, accustomed to victory, faced unexpected enemies and lost in a way it had never lost before. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one of these battles led to the greatest political reform in the history of Rome. Imagine the year 105 BC. The Roman Republic is at the absolute peak of its power, at the height of its glory. A little over 40 years had passed since its eternal enemy, Carthage, had been wiped off the face of the earth, and less than a century since its crushing victory over the brilliant Hannibal. The Mediterranean Sea had become an inland lake for the Romans, Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Macedonian phalanxes, heirs of Alexander the Great, were defeated and humiliated. The Greek city-states bowed their heads to the new ruler of the world. The legions, hardened by countless campaigns, were accustomed to victory as something self-evident. The invincibility of Roman arms had become almost an axiom, a fundamental truth, a symbol of an unshakable order and civilization that no other people on earth seemed to be able to match. Over many years of successful campaigns in Spain, Africa, Greece, and Asia, Roman soldiers and their commanders had absorbed a sense of superiority. They were accustomed to looking down on any opponent, be it the cunning Numidians, the proud Iberians, or the pampered Hellenes. Driven by hunger or climate change in their distant homeland, presumably in Jutland, they rolled south like an avalanche toward rich and sunny Italy. They were unlike any enemy the Romans had encountered before. Their warriors were giants, fair-haired and blue-eyed, whose physical power and ferocity in battle were terrifying. Their tactics were unpredictable. Instead of orderly ranks and maneuvers, they descended on the enemy as a single, roaring mass, sweeping away everything in their path. The Romans would later call this onslaught Furor Teutonicus, Teutonic fury. Most importantly, they were not afraid of the famous Roman legions. They had already won several victories over Roman forces in the Alpine foothills, proving that the eagles of the legions were nothing more than a coveted trophy for them. Rome, alarmed but still full of pride, sent not 1 but 2 consular armies to solve the problem. A colossal force capable, it seemed, of conquering any kingdom. But it was here, on the banks of the Rhone River, that the Republic suffered the most terrible and humiliating defeat in its history. A defeat that centuries later would be talked about much less than Cannae or the Teutoburg forest. A tragedy born not of the strength of the enemy, but of the weakness and vices of the Romans themselves. 2 Roman commanders stood in the way of the barbarian horde, Proconsul Quintus Servilius Capio and the acting consul Gnaeus Mallius Maximus. They were united by a common goal, the protection of the Republic, but divided by a deep chasm of personal ambition, class hatred, and arrogance, which ultimately led to an unimaginable tragedy. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the role of the commander's personal ambitions in such a crushing defeat? Write about it in the comments. The year 53 BC is forever remembered in Roman history as a symbol of crushing humiliation. A year when Rome faced an army that it not only failed to defeat, but was torn apart and disgraced by. At the center of this tragedy stands one of the most influential men of his time, Marcus Licinius Crassus. As a member of the First Triumvirate, alongside the rising star of the Gallic Wars, Gaius Julius Caesar, and the renowned commander Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Crassus possessed almost limitless wealth. He made his fortune through real estate speculation and the suppression of Spartacus's rebellion, but his soul craved something else, military glory equal to that of his co-rulers. Caesar conquered Gaul, Pompey cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and conquered the East. Crassus, despite all his money, lacked the most important thing: the laurels of a great conqueror. His ambitious goal was to conquer Parthia, a powerful and mysterious kingdom stretching across the lands of ancient Persia. It was a campaign undertaken solely out of personal vanity, without any clear provocation from the Parthians, and without the official approval of the Senate. Crassus was recklessly confident of victory. How could he doubt it? After all, he commanded a colossal army: 7 legions, 4,000 light infantry, and 4,000 cavalry, totaling more than 40,000 elite, battle-hardened soldiers. This was a force capable of crushing any kingdom Rome had ever encountered. Ignoring the bad omens and the advice of experienced legates who suggested marching through friendly Armenia, Crassus led his army on the shortest road, through the scorching Mesopotamian desert. Crassus and his overconfident army crossed the Euphrates River, invading enemy territory. The Parthians were already waiting for them, but not in the way the Roman expected. Instead of lining up their infantry for a decisive battle, under the leadership of the brilliant young commander Surena, they lured the Romans deep into the sun-scorched, waterless desert. They did not engage in direct combat, where the Roman legionnaires had an undeniable advantage. The Parthians preferred to use their unique, deadly tactics based on 2 types of troops: thousands of elusive mounted archers and a striking corps of heavy cavalry, the cataphracts. The Romans were excellently armed and protected, but their entire military doctrine was based on fighting in close formation, on wall-to-wall clashes, where they could put their discipline and skill in hand-to-hand combat to good use. In the desert against the Parthian army, this proved useless. The Battle of Carrhae began with Parthian horse archers, like a flock of birds of prey, surrounding the giant but unwieldy Roman square and showering it with a thick rain of heavy arrows. This came as a real shock to the legionaries. They were used to a short exchange of javelins and an immediate transition to close combat, rather than endless long-range shooting. The powerful Parthian composite bows struck with incredible force. Their arrows easily pierced leather and chainmail armor, and the famous Roman scutum shields, against which swords and spears were powerless, were pierced through, often nailing the shield to the warrior's arm. The legionaries could only helplessly close ranks and stand under this deadly hail, unable to strike back at the constantly moving enemy. When the Roman ranks were thrown into confusion by the incessant barrage, the cataphracts entered the fray. They were a terrifying force. The horsemen and their horses were clad from head to toe in scale or plate armor, turning them into living steel-battering rams. Armed with long, heavy canto spears, they charged at full speed into the weakened sections of the Roman formation, breaking through it, sowing death and panic, and then retreating in an orderly fashion under the cover of their archers, not giving the Romans time to recover and counterattack. They did not allow the legionaries to surround them or retreat safely from the battlefield. It was the perfect hammer and anvil tactic, with the archers as the anvil, exhausting and immobilizing the enemy, and the cataphracts as the hammer, delivering crushing blows. Crassus, an old and experienced politician but a mediocre commander, could not understand how to fight such an elusive and inscrutable enemy. Any attempt by his son Publius to break through with a cavalry unit and attack the archers ended in tragedy. The Parthians lured them deep into the desert, surrounded them, and completely destroyed them. Having lost his son and the best part of his cavalry, Crassus ordered his legionaries to form an even tighter defensive formation, which proved to be a fatal mistake. The giant square of tens of thousands of men became a perfect, immobile target. Throughout the long, agonizing day, tormented by thirst, the scorching sun, and fear, the Romans bled to death under incessant fire. The Parthian archers seemed to have an endless supply of arrows. As it turned out later, Surena had organized a caravan of 1,000 camels to deliver ammunition directly to the battlefield. By the end of the day, only a demoralized and wounded remnant remained of Crassus's great army. About 20,000 Roman soldiers died in this terrible battle, and another 10,000 were taken prisoner. In the next chapter, you will learn how this defeat and the ensuing civil war led to the greatest political reform in the history of Rome, forever changing its face. The Battle of Adrianople, which took place on August 9, 378 AD, was not just another tragedy for Rome. It was a harbinger of its decline. This battle, like a deep, unhealed wound, marked a turning point in the history of the late Roman Empire. If previous defeats were heavy blows from which the empire, gathering its strength, still rose, then Adrianople was the knockout that permanently undermined its power and led to a slow but steady decline. At that time, Rome was no longer the monolithic state it had been during the Republic or under the early emperors. The vast, cumbersome empire, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, was divided into two parts for ease of administration, the Western and Eastern empires. The eastern part, which was richer and more stable, with its capital in Constantinople, was ruled by Emperor Flavius Julius Valens. And it was he who had to face the crisis that determined the fate of the entire Roman world. On the northern border of his possessions, along the mighty Danube, huge masses of Gothic tribes had gathered. They did not come as conquerors, they came as refugees, desperately seeking asylum from the empire. The reason for their exodus was a new, terrifying force that had swept in from the Asian steppes, the Huns. These ferocious nomads swept away everything in their path, and the Goths, saving their lives, sought protection behind the seemingly impenetrable borders of Rome. After much hesitation, Emperor Valens agreed to accept them. This decision could have been a triumph for Roman diplomacy and power. The empire would have gained tens of thousands of potential soldiers and farmers to populate the depopulated borderlands. But in reality, it turned into a disaster due to two classic Roman vices of the time: corruption and arrogance. Local Roman officials and military commanders, Lupicinus and Maximus, saw the hungry and desperate refugees not as new subjects, but as a source of profit. They created unbearable conditions. They took away the Goths' weapons, starved them, and then sold them food at exorbitant prices. It got to the point where the Goths were forced to sell their own children into slavery for meager food, such as the meat of dead dogs. This inhuman plunder and humiliation was the last straw. The Goths, pushed to their limits, rebelled. Those whom Rome could have made its loyal allies became its worst enemies on its own territory. Valens, who was in distant Antioch preparing for war with Persia, fatally underestimated the scale of the threat. In his eyes, the Goths, whom the Romans had repeatedly defeated in the past, remained nothing more than a mob of savages, incapable of resisting the power and discipline of his legions. Blinded by this arrogance, he decided to personally lead a punitive expedition to teach the barbarians a lesson. He assembled an impressive army, but made a fatal mistake. Consumed by a thirst for personal glory, he did not wait for reinforcements from his nephew, Emperor Gratian of the Western Roman Empire, who was already rushing to his aid after a brilliant victory over the Germans. Valens wanted this triumph to belong to him alone. The battle took place on a stiflingly hot August day. The Roman army, raised before dawn, made an exhausting 12-kilometer march across the sun-scorched Thracian plain without water or rest to catch up with the enemy. The soldiers approached the Gothic camp, made up of linked carts, Wagenburg, completely exhausted, suffering from thirst and heat. The Goths, on the other hand, were full of strength. Their infantry calmly awaited the Romans behind the fortifications of their camp, while their cavalry was absent, out foraging. The Battle of Adrianople became one of the bloodiest and most one-sided battles in Roman history. Beginning with chaotic attacks by individual Roman units, it quickly escalated into a full-scale confrontation. This step, which began with a treaty with the Goths after Adrianople, marked the beginning of the end. The barbarian chiefs and their retinues became the main military force within the empire itself, which ultimately led to its complete decline and fall in the West. Adrianople was the final nail in the coffin of the classical Roman military system. The year 34 BC was the year when the agony of the Roman Republic reached its peak. The year when the two greatest armies in the world, both calling themselves Roman, clashed in a decisive naval battle. But this was not a war between two empires, but the final act of a tragedy between two titans. Gaius Octavian, Caesar's cold and calculating heir, and Mark Antony, a brilliant commander and charismatic leader who became the ally and lover of the Egyptian Queen Cleopatra. It was not just a battle for power, it was the culmination of a long civil war, a clash of two worlds, the ascetic, traditional West represented by Octavian, and the luxurious, Hellenistic East, whose rulers Antony and Cleopatra dreamed of becoming. After Caesar's assassination and the defeat of his killers, the world was divided between the triumvirs. Octavian ruled Rome and the western provinces, while Antony took the rich east for himself. There he met Cleopatra VII, the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and this union changed everything. Octavian waged a subtle propaganda war in Rome, portraying Antony as a man who had betrayed Roman values, fallen under the spell of an Eastern sorceress, and dreamed of moving the capital of the world to Alexandria. Antony in turn saw Octavian as nothing more than a rootless youngster who had usurped Caesar's name. Tensions grew over the years and finally erupted into open war. Two giant fleets met at Cape Actium on the west coast of Greece. The fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra was impressive. About 500 ships, many of which were veritable floating fortresses, huge, heavy quinqueremes, and even decemirames with towers and catapults. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, was smaller in number but consisted mainly of light and fast libyerns. These were maneuverable ships, modeled after pirate vessels, ideal for hit-and-run tactics. Antony relied on overwhelming power in boarding, while Agrippa relied on speed, maneuverability, and wearing down the enemy. The battle began on a warm September morning on September 2nd. Antony's troops, long confined by Agrippa in the Gulf of Ambracia, were suffering from disease and desertion, and this battle was a desperate attempt to break through. What do you think would have happened if Cleopatra had not fled? The year 260 AD. This is not just a date, it is a diagnosis. The Roman Empire, once an indestructible colossus, is shaking in the throes of a profound systemic crisis that historians would call the crisis of the 3rd century. The entire familiar world is falling apart at the seams. The empire was torn apart by endless internal conflicts. Over the past half-century, more than 20 soldier emperors had come and gone, proclaimed and killed by their own legions. The economy is in ruins. The silver denarius has turned into a copper coin with a thin layer of silver plating, and galloping inflation is destroying trade. Gangs of deserters roam the roads, and cities are emptying due to the Cyprian plague, a terrible pandemic that has claimed millions of lives and undermined the last vestiges of the state. In the west, in Gaul, entire provinces have broken away to form their own Gallic empire. And in the east, on the ruins of the old Parthian kingdom, a new, far more formidable and ambitious enemy has risen. This was the Sassanid Empire, a revived Persian empire, full of energy and revanchist sentiments. Its ruler, Shapur-Thamur, bore the proud title of King of Kings of Iran and non-Iran, and saw himself as the heir to Darius and Xerxes. His main goal was not simply to make raids, but to regain all the lands that had previously belonged to the Persian Empire of the Achaemenids, including Syria, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Unlike the Parthians, the Sassanids created a centralized state with a powerful bureaucracy and an aggressive state religion, Zoroastrianism. Their army was one of the most advanced in the world at that time. It was to counter this deadly threat that the Roman Emperor Valerian himself went to the east. He was not just another adventurous general, but a representative of the old senatorial aristocracy who came to power in his old age. He sincerely tried to save the crumbling state by sharing power with his son, Gallienus. The son was to hold back the barbarians on the Rhine and Danube, while the father was to stop Persian expansion. Valerian assembled a huge army of about 70,000 men, including legions from all over the East and even elite Praetorian cohorts. It showed the whole world that the empire was rapidly weakening. Its legions were no longer invincible, and its emperor, considered a living god on earth, was no longer untouchable. This defeat became one of the most vivid and tragic symbols of the decline and subsequent fall of the great Roman Empire. In 451 AD, the Western Roman Empire was a mere shadow of its former glory. It was a colossus with feet of clay, already in a state of profound and irreversible decline. Emperor Valentinian III was merely a puppet, holed up behind the impenetrable marshes of Ravenna, while real power belonged to the barbarian commanders. Africa, the breadbasket of Rome, had been captured by the Vandals. Spain and most of Gaul were controlled by the Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks, who were formally considered allies or federates, but in reality had created their own kingdoms on Roman soil. Barbarian tribes raged on the borders and within the empire itself, ravaging the last prosperous lands and plundering cities. But amid all this chaos, there was another, far more terrifying force that threatened to wipe out the Romans and the barbarians, everything that remained of civilization. These were the Huns. From the depths of the Asian steppes, a nomadic empire created by fire and sword descended upon Europe. They were led by Attila, a figure who inspired mystical terror in his contemporaries. He was called not simply a king or a conqueror, but the scourge of God, a punishment sent by heaven for the sins of mankind. He led not just an army, but an entire horde consisting of dozens of conquered peoples: the Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, and Heralds. This horde was intent on total destruction and plunder of everything in its path. In 451, under the pretext of a dispute over the dowry of the Roman Princess Honoria, Attila invaded Gaul, the richest of Rome's remaining provinces. He burned cities, slaughtered the population, and it seemed that nothing could stop him. But standing in his way was a man known as the Last Roman, Flavius Aetius. He was an outstanding military leader and an even more brilliant diplomat who, for decades, kept the crumbling empire from collapse by skillfully pitting barbarian tribes against each other. Aetius spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns and knew Attila personally. The decisive battle took place on the Catalaunian fields, a vast plain in northeastern Gaul. This battle became one of the most terrible, bloody, and large-scale in the history of late antiquity. According to contemporary estimates, hundreds of thousands of warriors from all over Europe clashed in this fierce battle. It was a true battle of the nations. In the center of the battlefield was a valley divided by a hill, which was of key tactical importance. The battle began with a frantic race for this hill. The allies managed to outrun the Huns and take an advantageous position at the top. Seeing this, Attila addressed his warriors with a fiery speech and threw his horde into a furious attack. The Huns, using their favorite tactic of swift cavalry attacks, broke through to the center of the Allied forces, where Aetius had prudently placed the unreliable Alans. The Alans faltered and fled, but this breakthrough was part of the plan. Now the Hun horde was caught between two flanks, the Visigoths on the right and Aetius Romans on the left. Throughout the long and bloody day, both armies fought in tight formation. The ground was soaked with blood, and the losses grew with every minute. In this meat grinder, the old king of the Visigoths, Theodoric, fell, thrown from his horse and trampled by his own warriors. But his death did not break the Goths, only inflamed their fury. By evening, the counterattack of the Visigoths, led by Theodoric's son Torismond, and the steadfastness of Aetius's legions had done their job. The Huns were repelled and surrounded in their camp, which was made up of carts. Attila himself, seeing defeat was inevitable, ordered a funeral pyre to be built from horse saddles so he could throw himself into the fire rather than be taken prisoner. Tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of people died. The battle itself was formally inconclusive because neither side was able to completely destroy the enemy. Attila was not completely defeated, but his myth of invincibility was destroyed. What do you think would have happened if the Allied army had won?
Citizens of Rome, we
101 BC was the year when Rome finally washed away the shame of its most terrible defeat with blood and steel. Only 4 years had passed since the disaster at Arausio, where 2 Roman consuls, out of pride and envy, led to the death of more than 80,000 soldiers. After that battle, terror Cimbricus gripped the Republic. It seemed that nothing could stop the savage hordes of Cimbri and Teutons, and the road to defenseless Rome was open. At this moment of despair, when the old aristocracy had completely discredited itself, Rome turned to its only savior, a man of humble origins, a stern and experienced soldier named Gaius Marius. Marius was not a patrician. He was a new man who had achieved everything on his own. It was to him, elected consul and unprecedented 5 times in a row, that the Roman people entrusted their fate. And Marius understood that to defeat such an enemy, it was not enough to simply assemble a new army. It was necessary to create a completely new type of army. He carried out a radical military reform that forever changed the face of the Roman legions. Previously, the army had been a militia of landowning citizens. Marius opened the legions to all citizens, even landless paupers, turning military service from a duty into a profession. He promised them a salary, a share of the spoils, and a land grant after retirement. Thus was born a professional standing army, loyal not so much to the Senate as to its commander, who led it to glory and wealth. He also changed the very structure of the legion, making the cohort the main tactical unit. He improved the weaponry by introducing the famous Marius Pilum, a javelin that bent when it hit a shield, rendering it useless. Marius also turned his legionaries into real athletes, forcing them to carry all their equipment themselves. They were nicknamed Marius Mules, and this mobile, resilient, and disciplined army became the most perfect fighting machine of its time. While the Cimbri and Teutons roamed Spain and Gaul, Marius spent several years forging and tempering this new weapon. In 102 BC, he had already proven its power by completely destroying the Teutonic tribe at the Battle of Aquae Sextii. Now it was the Cimbri's turn. Crossing the Alps, a huge horde of Cimbri invaded northern Italy, defeating the army of the second consul, Quintus Lutatius Catulus. The road to Rome was open again. Gaius Marius marched his victorious legions from Gaul at a forced pace and joined forces with the remnants of Catulus's army. The fate of the Republic was to be decided in one final, decisive battle. Marius was an experienced and cautious commander. He did not attack the enemy head-on in an unfavorable location. He allowed the Cimbri to choose the battlefield themselves, but at the same time skillfully maneuvered so that the field would be advantageous to him. This place was a wide, sun-scorched plain near Vercellae. The Battle of Vercellae, which took place on a hot summer day, became one of the bloodiest and most one-sided battles in Roman history. It began with Marius demonstrating his tactical genius. He positioned his troops so that the midday sun and the wind, which raised clouds of dust, blew directly into the faces of the advancing Cimbri. Blinded and disoriented, the barbarians rushed into the attack. Their formidable infantry, consisting of huge warriors with shields and long swords, collided with the iron wall of the Roman legions. Marcus's new army acted as a single mechanism. The first row of legionaries threw their pilums, which disabled the Cimbri shields, after which the closed Roman formation, armed with short gladiuses, moved into close combat. At the same time, the Roman heavy cavalry, commanded by Marius' future enemy, the young and talented Lucius Cornelius Sulla, crushed the Cimbri cavalry on the flanks and attacked their infantry from the rear. Surrounded, blinded, and exhausted by the heat, the barbarians could not withstand the attack. Their formation was broken, and the battle turned into a merciless slaughter. According to various estimates, between 65,000 and 100,000 Cimbri were killed. Tens of thousands, mostly women and children, were taken prisoner and sold into slavery. Seeing the complete defeat of their husbands, the Cimbri women committed mass suicide, first killing their children and then themselves, so as not to fall into the hands of the victors. The battle was not just a defeat of the enemy army, but the complete destruction of an entire people who had terrorized Rome for more than 10 years. For Rome, it was not just a victory. It was a resounding triumph that completely restored its shaken faith in its invincibility and its destiny to rule the world. Gaius Marius was proclaimed the third founder of Rome and became the most influential man in the Republic. This battle was the culmination and main proof of the success of Gaius Marius' military reform. It clearly showed the whole world that the new professional, disciplined, well-trained, and well-armed Roman army was capable of defeating any enemy, even the most ferocious and numerous. It was this army that would conquer Gaul in the following century, conquer the entire Mediterranean world, and ultimately bury the Republic, creating an eternal empire on its ruins. "190 BC was the year when Rome, having crushed Carthage and subjugated Greece, faced the last great Hellenistic empire, the Seleucid state. After defeating Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, Rome became the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Then after defeating the Macedonian king Philip V, it took control of the Balkans under the slogan of liberating the Greeks. Now the Republic's gaze turned further east to the vast and fabulously rich Seleucid Empire, the last remnant of Alexander the Great's empire, which still retained its superpower status. Its ruler, Antiochus III, bore the proud title of the Great, and he deserved it. During his decades of rule, he restored the kingdom's borders from the Aegean Sea to India, conducting successful campaigns and consolidating his power. He considered himself the true heir of Alexander and the defender of the Hellenistic world. He perceived Rome's growing influence in the East as a direct threat. Conflict was inevitable. Adding fuel to the fire was the fact that Rome's worst enemy, the brilliant Hannibal Barca, had found refuge at Antiochus's court. The very thought that Hannibal could lead a new army against them terrified the Roman Senate. Antiochus, confident in the strength of his huge army and encouraged by his advisors, invaded Greece to liberate it from the Romans. But he severely underestimated the military power and iron will of the Roman legions. The Battle of Magnesia in Asia Minor was the climax of this war. It was a clash between two great armies, two different military philosophies. The Roman army was formerly commanded by the consul Lucius Cornelius Scipio, but everyone understood that the real mastermind behind the campaign was his older brother, the legendary Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal. He could not be consul, but went to war as an advisor legate, and his mere presence instilled unshakable confidence in the soldiers. Antiochus's army outnumbered and outmatched the Roman army. Its core was the unbreakable Macedonian phalanx, a wall of 16,000 warriors with long sarissa spears. It was supported by heavy cavalry in shining armor, chariots with scythes on their wheels, archers, slingers, and, most importantly, 54 African war elephants, the super weapon of the ancient world, which was supposed to trample and put the Roman infantry to flight. The battle began on a foggy morning. The Romans, using tactics they had perfected over centuries, did not attack the impenetrable phalanx head-on. Instead, they concentrated their main attacks on the enemy's flanks, which were manned by less reliable troops. A key role in this was played by the Romans' ally, King Eumenes II of Pergamon, whose cavalry attacked Antiochus's left flank. The first victims were the chariots. The lightly armed Roman velites met them with a hail of javelins. The wounded horses, maddened by pain and fear, turned around and crashed into their own ranks, disrupting the formation and spreading panic. Then it was the turn of the war elephants. The Romans had already learned how to fight them during the wars with Pyrrhus and Hannibal. They did not try to stop the giants, but stepped aside, letting them pass through their ranks, while simultaneously showering them with javelins from the flanks, aiming at the drivers and the unprotected sides of the animals. The frightened and wounded elephants, having lost control, broke through their own ranks in panic, crashing right into the center of their own phalanx and disrupting its monolithic formation. The heirs of Alexander the Great were absorbed or subjugated by Rome, which, having crushed its last serious competitor, became the sole superpower of the ancient world. The Battle of Magnesia was the last chapter in the history of Hellenism and the first chapter in the history of Rome's global domination. "390 BC, this date was burned into the memory of the Romans as a symbol of the greatest horror and humiliation. It was one of the first and most terrible tragedies in the history of young Rome. an event that left a deep scar on its collective consciousness for many centuries. At that time, Rome was not yet the ruler of the world, but only one of the powerful city-states in Italy, having recently defeated its main rival, the Etruscan city of Veii, and subjugated the neighboring Latin tribes. The Romans felt confident, but their world was still small and vulnerable, as they were about to discover in the most brutal way. From the north, beyond the Alps, the fertile lands of Italy were invaded by the Gallic tribes of the Senones. To the Romans, these were barbarians unlike any they had encountered before. Tall, fair-haired, fierce warriors who fought with wild, unbridled fury, often bare-chested, uttering deafening battle cries. They were led by a chieftain named Brennus. The conflict began because of Roman arrogance. When the Gauls laid siege to the Etruscan city of Clusium, the Romans sent envoys to negotiate. But the envoys, violating their sacred diplomatic status, joined the battle on the side of the Etruscans. Enraged by this betrayal, Brennus lifted the siege of Clusium and led his army straight to Rome to avenge the insult. The Romans, full of pride after their recent victories, sent an army to stop them, but things did not go as planned. The two armies met at the Allia River, just a few kilometers from Rome. That day, July 18th, went down in the Roman calendar as a black day, Dies Alliensis, considered unlucky. The Battle of Allia was short but incredibly bloody. The Roman army, fighting in the cumbersome Greek phalanx formation, was completely unprepared for the Gauls' tactics. The deafening battle cry and the sight of an avalanche of fierce warriors rushing towards them caused panic. The Gaulish attack crushed and overturned the inexperienced Roman flanks, after which the entire army turned and fled in panic. It was not a battle, but a massacre. Thousands of Romans were killed or drowned in the Tiber while trying to escape. Rome was left defenseless. The remnants of the defeated army and the most valiant warriors barricaded themselves on Capitoline Hill, the last stronghold of resistance. The rest of the city was left to its fate. After that, the Gauls entered Rome. They found the city almost empty, but in the Forum, according to legend, they were met with an incredible sight. Old senators in ceremonial robes sat motionless in their chairs, full of contempt for the barbarians. This scene so struck the Gauls that they mistook them for statues until one of them dared to touch a senator's beard. The humiliation suffered at the hands of Brennus gave rise to a deep Gallic fear among the Romans, which 300 years later would result in the merciless conquest of all Gaul by Julius Caesar. Rome learned the main lesson from this tragedy. Security and greatness can only be ensured by indestructible military power.
Look, the Shadow lifts.
In 202 BC, the Second Punic War ended. 17 years of uninterrupted horror, despair, and unparalleled courage that nearly destroyed the Roman Republic. All these years, the shadow of one man hung over Rome like a storm cloud, Hannibal Barca. Crossing the Alps with his army and war elephants, he swept through Italy with fire and sword, inflicting a series of crushing defeats on the Romans at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and, most devastatingly, at Cannae. The catastrophe at Cannae, where virtually the entire Roman army was destroyed, brought the Republic to the brink of total collapse. But Rome, showing incredible resilience, did not give up. And so, after a decade and a half, the war came to its logical conclusion. The Roman army, now under the command of the young and brilliant General Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Africanus, faced Hannibal's army, who was forced to leave Italy to defend his native Carthage. Scipio, whose father and uncle had died in this war, and who himself had miraculously survived at Cannae, used Hannibal's own strategy against him. He took the war to enemy territory. After landing in Africa, he gave Carthage a choice: either surrender the city or recall Hannibal for a decisive battle. Carthage chose the latter. The Battle of Zama, which took place on the African plain, was one of the greatest and most fateful in world history. It was a duel not just between two armies, but between two titans of military art. Hannibal had a motley army under his command. Its vanguard consisted of 80 war elephants, which were supposed to crush the Roman ranks. The first line consisted of Gaulish and Ligurian mercenaries, the second of Carthaginian militiamen, but his main strength was the third line. His veterans, hardened by 15 years of campaigning in Italy. These were the best soldiers in the world, and Hannibal pinned all his hopes on them. Scipio, for his part, used not just brute force, but tactics that he had developed and perfected over many years of fighting in Spain. He knew that the main threat was Hannibal's elephants and his superiority in infantry, but Scipio had his own trump card. For the first time in the entire war, the Roman cavalry, thanks to an alliance with the Numidian king Massinissa, outnumbered the Carthaginian cavalry. At the same time, the Roman and Numidian cavalry, which was well-trained and motivated, attacked the enemy's flanks, which had been weakened by panic. The Carthaginian cavalry was quickly defeated and put to flight. The Roman horsemen, resisting the temptation to plunder the enemy camp, rushed in pursuit to prevent them from returning to the battlefield. A fierce infantry battle ensued. Step by step, the Roman legionaries pushed through and destroyed first the first and then the second line of Hannibal's army. But now they had to face the last line of defense, the Italian veterans. And at this most critical moment, when the outcome of the battle hung in the balance, the Roman cavalry returned to the battlefield. They struck the rear of Hannibal's invincible veterans. It was a maneuver that mirrored Hannibal's own tactics at Cannae. Surrounded on all sides, his army was doomed. Hannibal was completely defeated. It was his first and last crushing defeat in a major field battle. The Battle of Zama ended the Second Punic War. Carthage was forced to accept a humiliating peace. It lost all its overseas possessions, its entire fleet, and the right to wage war without Rome's permission. Its power was brought to an end. Rome, having crushed its only serious rival, became the sole and absolute ruler of the entire Mediterranean. The victory at Zama paved the way for its world domination. We conclude our journey into the world of Rome's deadly battles, which you may never have heard of. Today we learned that even the great Roman Empire, accustomed to victory, faced unexpected defeats. These battles are not just stories about wars and commanders. They are about how an empire changed its attitude towards its enemies, its leaders, and itself. They are about how even the most crushing defeat can be a reason for great reform. Which of these battles, which you may not have heard of, did you find most interesting? Share your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next videos.